All right. I think we're live. And at the same time, I'm afraid that I'm going to get some feedback in a second. Nope, I'm not. Okay, we're live. So professional, isn't it? So welcome to the Open Faith discussion today. I've got Corey with me. I think Marty might join us a little bit later. That might be all we get. Some others might pop in, but we are talking today about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints supporting the Respect for Marriage Act that is currently a bill in Congress, and kind of our own thoughts and response on that. I want to go ahead and share the text of that, and we'll just take a look at what that Respect for Marriage Act is. But I believe it was the beginning was, correct me if I'm wrong, Corey, it's like the beginning of this week, about Monday, that the church came out and said that they support this Respect for Marriage Act with the new amendment, or with the protections that it provides for religious organizations. And it's kind of been all over in at least newspapers that cover anything having to do with the church, because a little bit of a shocker, it seems, where it supports legalizing same-sex marriage throughout the entire country, at least, what's the word I'm looking for, but protecting marriages that have been solemnized in the States. But as I try to get to the text of that, you want to jump in and comment just on your initial reaction when you heard that news?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I had to read up on exactly what was in the bill, and so as far as I understand, it's mostly protecting so that if you cross state lines, for example, if, let's say, for some reason in the future the Supreme Court ruling on same-sex marriage was struck down, if you, let's say, you were in Utah and they didn't legalize same-sex marriage, but you were same-sex married in California, and then you came to Utah, I think this protects that, saying the state still has to recognize your legal status as being married. And so this is mostly protecting that. So yeah, my initial reaction was, yeah, I admit I was a little surprised with, just because I had heard a lot of, because I try to be middle road, but I listen to, I read some CNN, I listen to some conservative podcasts, and like the conservative podcasts were all like, this is still a very bad thing and we shouldn't be supporting it. And it's the title of it, Respect for Marriage, is anything but that. It's the opposite. It's the disrespect for, marriage as defined as a man and a woman. It's exactly saying, it blows up that definition, saying it's not that. It can be anything, all these other things. But the support that the church is giving for, at least from what I've been able to gather, is, well, there's two things. Because like part of my, and the reactions I've seen online are like, it's not really a big deal. They're just basically, doing this because they are giving up the fight for the way that, like, the secular fight, I guess they say. They're ceding the secular fight, and they're retrenching basically on the religious part, with saying like, okay, I guess our new stance is, because I think back in the day when they were doing like Prop 8 and stuff like that, they've always had the same motivation, but I think back then they were seeing it as like, okay, here's the
That's
thing,
the California proposition, right? That
yes, the California proposition from 2008 that basically
constitutional amendment in California that was going to, propose that marriage be between only one man and one woman, and the church was behind that, saying, supporting that, and it actually passed. I mean, they were pouring money into it, and they were telling their church members in California to support it, and it actually passed, but then was a short-lived victory for the supporters of Prop 8, because the courts there later just a couple months later, I think, overturned that as being unconstitutional. Okay. Sorry, keep going.
yeah, that's right. And then the Supreme Court ruled, and then the Obergefell, I can't even say it. Obergefell, there we go. There's the Supreme Court case that ultimately said it was legal everywhere. And so I think since then, the church has changed their battle tactics, if you will, because I think ultimately the main motivation of the church in all of this is saying, okay, here's the thing. In our religion, it's not like most other Christian religions either, where like, you get married and then after in heaven, then that marriage just goes away and we're all like the same unto God, and all that stuff goes away. To us, it's of utmost importance because it's part of like your eternal potential to be in this, union of man and woman. Like it's like almost in certain, strains of our theology, it's essential to the highest levels of exaltation or godhood. And so it's that important and that stake that they have in it. And I think for
Right, just
prostate,
it's a unique doctrine in Christianity, like you're saying, that we focus so much on families and on specifically on eternal families, because we say we're literally the offspring of God, of heavenly parents. We'll even talk about a heavenly mother, right? And so there's a heavenly father, a heavenly mother, and this idea that we're trying to become like them. And so eternal families become a huge part of that, right? So keep going. Sorry to interrupt.
yeah, well, and that's it. So they take the spiritual, or they take the, the societal structure that we have here, but they put it in and exalt it. So like, no, this is not only, an earthly thing, this is a godly thing. This is, the goal of your entire existence really is to do this thing, is to make this union, and then, continue the chain of, progressing of intelligences or spirit children or whatever forever. And so anyway, I think with that as the background and their motivation, I think back in 2008, they were mostly saying, okay, well, that's our stake in this. And so we have to protect our religious freedom to be able to make sure that that's how, we don't have to like break that. And so I think back then they looked at the public opinion and said, okay, there's enough people out there in the public besides us that have the same view. And so we're going to call to arms all the people that are like us and say, let's go, other Christians, let's go, conservative America, be on our side. And we're going to, unite all these people and try to vote against this so that our religious interests are protected. And I think over the years,
when you're talking about the religious interests, I mean, not that the government could declare, okay, marriage is between any consenting adults, and therefore suddenly that changes the eternal doctrine of marriage.
Exactly, it doesn't change the doctrine.
That we that in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we perform these sealing ordinances, these marriage ceremonies inside temples that are intended to last for time and for all eternity, so for this life and beyond. And that the church was afraid, leaders of the church were afraid that if marriage was recognized, same-sex marriage was legal throughout the country, and it was illegal to discriminate, that the church would then be forced to actually perform same-sex marriages and same-sex sealings in the church, or they would lose their tax preferred status, or they might lose just their status as a legal religion or something, that they, because they were what's the word I'm looking for, discriminating and not allowing same-sex marriages to take place, and they weren't performing them. Anyway, the church didn't want to be forced to perform those marriages, right?
And almost like, forced to have what the LDS church would probably view as like, and not because like gay people are bad or something, but just the being forced by the government to, take this very sacred thing where it's like, and again, I'm not of another religion, so I don't know exactly how marriage is viewed other than like a godly union, but like this is paramount to the LDS faith. And so to have to the fear of having to perform, homosexual marriage in an LDS temple is like the worst thing that they could think of, I guess. Like this is literally coming in and like forcing your ways and desecrating our religion in some way, as far as I understand.
So it's interesting because when this was happening, the Prop 8 stuff, and as the discussion of same-sex marriages has unfolded across the country, I remember a definite time, some 7 to 10 years ago, when I was expressing to those who were around me. At the time, I was serving on a high council and talking to my friends and other members, and saying, it seemed to us, at least to those that I talked to, almost like a no-brainer that the church should simply make clear its position that, okay, the law of the land can do whatever it wants, but the
sealings that take place in our temples, those are not legal marriages. Those are sealings for all eternity, for time and all eternity. And if the government recognizes them as legal marriages, fine, that's great. But if they choose not to, that's kind of no big deal. We'll still perform our sealings in the temple, and we'll have legal marriages outside the temple. And interestingly, a few years ago, the church dropped the requirement that had been in place where when you get married outside of the temple, you have to wait a year before you can be sealed inside the temple. And they changed that. And so now if you choose to, I suppose this can happen anywhere in the country. Am I right? That this is legal, or this is acceptable practice within the church anywhere in the world, that you can now have a marriage ceremony outside the temple, and then you can go and be sealed in the temple. And that was a few years ago. And that seemed at the time to me to be, oh, the church is finally heading this way. They're finally going to say that, look, marriages, legal marriages, are things that happen outside of temples, and we as a church don't perform them. And so therefore, since we don't perform legal marriages, we cannot be forced by the government to perform legal marriages for anyone, because we don't perform them at all. We only perform our sacred sealing ordinance for all eternity. And the government can't tell us who we can and can't seal, because as if the government cares who's sealed for all eternity, you know? So yeah. It seemed to me like that was the way they should have gone. And now we're getting closer and closer to that position.
We are. And to legitimize some of they weren't just, they weren't, I don't know how to say this other than they weren't just, being scared of their own shadow. Like there were some things and precedents and things going on in the legal world that were, pushing towards the opposite end of encroaching, forcing people to do things I guess I'll just cut to the chase of there was the cake making thing of the guy that was Christian or something. He's and they came in and they tried to sue him because he refused to bake a cake for this homosexual wedding, citing his religious views as the reason why he would refuse them service. And they're saying, well, that's discrimination. And he's saying, well, no, I'm not just a Christian at church, I'm also a Christian in my life and my work, and so my views permeate throughout my whole life, and I shouldn't be forced in my workplace to violate my religious views. And so I think the church saw that kind of case as also, reason to be well, we can all, the other side of this argument is pushing for more of that. It's not just acceptance and toleration, but you have to let us in and do, celebrate and all that stuff. I don't know. I hear this because, like I said, I'm conservative, but I'm not extreme conservative, but I have heard, amongst the people I talk to that are maybe a little more extreme conservative, that was the main fear of they say that, but they really want you to have to do this. They don't care about your religious freedom. It's not that you just tolerate it, it's that you celebrate it. And if you don't celebrate it, then you're in the wrong, and you have to, you're going to get publicly scorned, or we're going to take away your church tax exempt status and throw bricks through your windows or something, and there has been some of that. But anyway, getting around to this, I think the at least based on this support that they're putting forth and the things I've seen over the last few years, they also supported, I think it was just in Utah, but the church also came out to support it was more of an individual rights for LGBTQ people for housing in a couple of years ago, that just said you can't discriminate based on your sexual orientation for housing and stuff like that. So I mean, that was
right. That was that one that you're referring to was in Utah, right? And it was the first such, as I understand it, the first such law and this union or this partnership between I think it's I don't know if it's the Equality Now group and the church, but it's been patterned, or other state laws have been patterned after this Utah one. Now I think it's after Proposition 8, where the church recognized. Anyway. Okay, I read this in, I think, Salt Lake Tribune or somewhere. Somebody was commenting that basically after the church failed in their Prop 8 approach, the approach that you described earlier, where they said, look, everybody like-minded, let's get on board and let's stand behind this marriages between one man and one woman. And that essentially failed when the courts overturned that Prop 8 then the church kind of read the writing on the wall and they said, look, we've got to take this a different direction. And so what we're most concerned about, as we've said here, is our religious rights to practice our religion and worship as we please and to not be forced to perform religious ordinances for people that we don't believe we can perform those religious ordinances for. And so then they said, well, look, we're in favor of, I think I even read that they were essentially approached by the Equality Now people, or those who were on the side of same-sex marriage, who approached the leaders of the church and said, look, there's got to be some common ground. There's got to be some way that we can work this out, because we don't care. I think they said to the church leaders, we don't care how you worship, really. We don't care what your doctrine is. That's between you and your God and your people. What they said was, we just want to make sure that we have the same legal rights. And the church leaders, I think, heard that. And then, as you just said, came in with full support for this Utah law that protected the rights of those who wanted to enter into same-sex marriage, the legal rights, so that they could not be discriminated against, and that homosexuals could or would have all the same legal protections and no discrimination in the state of Utah from a legal standpoint, while also protecting the religions and those practicing and worshiping to not be forced to perform ordinances when they didn't feel that that was a valid thing. And so again, that was mirrored throughout a few different states. I don't know which states, but I've read that other states followed. And then now we have this law that I'll go ahead and share the screen for. And it is essentially that same kind of idea, where we have, whoops, I think I've just swapped out. There we go. Are you seeing the HR 8404?
Yeah, I see it now.
So yeah, and this is the amendment version put forth by the Senate, where they, struck out everything that the House had, I guess, passed, and they've replaced it. And essentially, it's basically the same as what the House passed, with a couple supporting sections that support religious freedom. It includes these findings, which are kind of weird, honestly. Congress finds the following: no union is more profound than marriage, for it embodies the highest ideals of love, fidelity, devotion, sacrifice, and family. Kind of a weird thing for Congress to find. I suppose that throughout the history of Congress, they have found such statements, and it seems like a couple hundred years ago or 100 years ago, as they're writing laws, they say this is why we're doing this, and this is why they're doing it. But it just seems weird that Congress would recognize no union is more profound than marriage. What exactly?
Well, it leaves out some of the better argued legal things I've heard, that as far as like the government's concerned, it's like, and the reason marriage is important is because it's like the cornerstone of our society and stuff like that. And like, without these marriage unions, and like it would destabilize society a little more. And so it's in our country's best interest to support marriages and stuff like that. Like, they didn't necessarily define it there, but yeah, if they had worded it there, like, this is a very new agey view on marriage, but yeah.
Okay. And then diverse beliefs about the role of gender in marriage are held by reasonable and sincere people based on decent and honorable religious or philosophical premises. Therefore, Congress affirms that such people and their diverse beliefs are due proper respect. Okay, good. Millions of people, including interracial and same-sex couples, have entered into marriages and have enjoyed the rights and privileges associated with marriage. Couples joining in marriage deserve to have the dignity, stability, and ongoing protection that marriage affords to families and children. That all sounds great. And so they repeal, what does it say, of section added to Title 28 by the Defense of Marriage Act. And I do you know, I think I've read somewhere what that's repealing. Do you know what that's repealing?
It's that thing I mentioned at the beginning. It's basically the opposite of what I said, where the Defense of Marriage Act would say things as like, if you get married in California because it's legal there, when you go to Utah, if they don't legalize same-sex marriage, then your marriage is null and void and they don't have to recognize it. So that's why they repeal that, and they're replacing it with this thing that says exactly the opposite of, you do have to recognize that.
Right. The Defense of Marriage Act was to protect marriages between one man and one woman. And so we're, revoking that. And so now we give full faith and credit given to marriage equality. So we insert certain acts, records, of proceedings, and let's see. No person acting under the color of state law may deny full faith and credit to any public act, record, or judicial proceeding of any other state pertaining to a marriage between two individuals. Okay, so real quick, the first half of this is just restating the Constitution, right? We give full faith and credit to acts of the other states, but in this particular case, we're applying it to pertaining to a marriage between two individuals. And it's interesting there that it does say two individuals. So that's the first.
No polygamy.
Hint, hint that there's no polygamy here on the basis of the sex, race, ethnicity, or national origin of those individuals. Or again, so no person can deny a right or claim arising from such a marriage on the basis that such a marriage would not be recognized under the law of that state, on the basis of the sex, race, ethnicity, or national origin of those individuals. So it doesn't matter, as you just said, what your state laws are. You'll recognize a marriage if it was legal in the state where it took place, then it's legal now in all the states. And I'm going to skip a little bit ahead here to marriage recognition is also amended to read as follows: for the purposes of any federal law, rule, or regulation in which marital status is a factor. So where you're federally, so not only, okay, we've just read that every state must recognize the marriage performed legally in every other state. And now we're saying, and the federal law also recognizes a marriage performed legally. So for purposes of federal law, in which marriage is a factor, an individual shall be considered married if that individual's marriage is between, again, two individuals and is valid in the state where the marriage was entered into, or in the case of a marriage entered into outside of any state, so outside of the country or whatever, then if the marriage is between two individuals and is valid in the place where entered into, and the marriage could have been entered into in a state. So as long as there is at least one state that has the same kind of laws as where that marriage took place. And so then we define state, and in determining whether a marriage is valid in a state, only the law of the jurisdiction applicable at the time the marriage was entered into may be considered. So it's got to be also in time when the marriage happened, it had to have been legal. And that was essentially, if I understand correctly, the bulk of the bill as passed by the House, although the Senate inserted those first three findings, I think. And now we get to the rest of the amendment added by the Senate here, where they say no impact on religious liberty and conscience. Nothing in this act or any amendment made by this act shall be construed to diminish or abrogate a religious liberty or conscience protection otherwise available to an individual or organization under the Constitution of the United States or federal law. Now that's interesting right there, because that does it shall not diminish a religious liberty or conscience protection otherwise available to an individual or organization under the Constitution. So, boy, I don't think I noticed that before just now reading this. What do you think that means? I mean, it seems like I thought that this meant that your cake bakers, your individuals running a business, were not, there was no exception especially carved out for them. They had to essentially recognize marriage. The point is here, we can see that states must recognize same-sex marriages. We can see the federal government must recognize same-sex marriage. Legally, same-sex marriage will be permitted as the law of the land so long as where it was entered into, it was legal. That's essentially what this is saying. But now we've got this, the word saying that, but we're not diminishing religious liberties or conscience protections available to an individual. So if you religiously think that it's against my religion to serve this, same-sex couple, what does that mean? Boy, I didn't see.
Well, and that's the things I listened to on this. I mean, this is also one of the critiques of we shouldn't, why a conservative wouldn't want to support this is technically this isn't necessarily giving additional rights for anything of religious freedom, freedom of religion and how you practice it is in the, original Constitution of the United States of America, like this doesn't really add to that. It does define it a little more narrowly in context to this topic, I think, like you just read. So I think that's exactly why the church is actually, when they see something like that with that kind of amendment, that's why they jump on board, because that's exactly what they want. So saying it takes us to where we are now, which is where I think, like I was kind of going, I got a little sidetracked, my bad. But like the church's new stance seems to be more of what I would call basically what you stated, of pluralism, of like, okay, so the secular world is the secular world. And looks like we lost that fight. The public opinion is landsliding in this direction, and that's fine, because as long as we preserve what is our interest in this, we actually and here's where the conversation has changed a lot in the last 10, 15 years, where especially let's take one big example of where I think, and I don't know what his personal views are, but I think some of this is due to conversations that the church has had with LGBTQ organizations and things like that. And they've done that with like, the NAACP as well for like race relations. But I think the conversations that they've have shifted a lot of, hopefully, the views of the leaders of the church, whereas like, 10, 15 years ago and everything previous to that, you would get a lot of talks or like BYU speeches about like how being, just basically like anti-homosexual stuff, like it's bad, it's evil. If we allow like Oakes himself like has a lot of talk saying like, which is part of the conservative argument that like if we allow same-sex marriage, it will lead to the degradation and basically the falling apart of society in like a couple decades, because it just completely obliterates this prime unit of family. And so I think they've, in conversation and seeing the impact of what legalizing same-sex marriage has done, and they've come to the realization, which I mean, one would argue that, well, obviously, but like it actually doesn't hurt anybody technically to allow people to marry this way, legally, and it's not going to hurt us as a church to have people have that viewpoint, because we still can maintain that. And like I said, there are some reasons why it was a valid concern or an argument, but I think they're seeing more just because we've had to play it out across the country of what's going to happen. There have been a few court cases. I think the most extreme from the church, like I said, is Prop 8, or the things trying to make it not legal to get same-sex marriage and enshrine that, or pushing the other way with like the cake battle. Like, no, individuals not only have to let us do it, they have to accept it and support it, and their religious freedom ends at the church door. Once they walk out the church door, they have to, change. And so I think this is a really happy medium between those two things, where it's like you just read, individuals aren't forced to make any concessions like that whatsoever, because it's just the government itself. I think that's a win for the, people that support homosexual marriage as well, because the main things that you get from being legally married, because like you can get together and be like, we're together, we commit to each other forever. Why do you need the government to recognize that? Why is that so important? Well, people that are married legally do have, they get better tax status, I believe, or like, you can file jointly and things like that. Hospital visits, your next of kin or your family, and if you're not married legally, like you legally can't go like to your, your husband or wife, if you're whatever dying of cancer, you couldn't go visit them at a certain time. And those are just the examples that come to mind, but there are things like that like legally being married is important for that type of thing that would be afforded to any other person that had that marriage or committed type relationship that could legally get married. And so I think the church views this as, hopefully, I don't know where they're going to go from here, but like it's almost everything they want. It's saying, okay,
right. I guess what I'm seeing the same thing that you just said there, that as I'm looking at this now with, I guess, some fresh eyes here. I looked at it before, but I hadn't noticed that paragraph. And it sounds like what you're saying, this is pretty strongly in favor of where I feel the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints would stand on this position right now. Again, you've said that there are conservative organizations and other religions who are perhaps against this. And it surprises me a little that the equality groups, LGBTQ groups, and others would very much stand in favor of this, because it seems like if they could have what they wanted, they would want more than what this is offering. Because this right here, okay, if I'm understanding it correctly, it's just as you just said, that same-sex marriage is the legal law of the land, as in if it's legal in the state where it took place, or if it's legal wherever the marriage took place outside of the states, that now all states, the government of the states, must recognize that marriage as legal, and that the federal government also will recognize that marriage as legal. But that's the end of what this law says. It stops short of saying that discrimination from private individuals or companies or anything shall be prohibited. Essentially, if you have a religious objection, at least, for serving same-sex couples right here, then whether that's a personal religious or a business religious, or whether your organization or your individual conscience tells you that you should not or don't want to serve these individuals, that you're still, this act does not prohibit that kind of discrimination. I just want to point out that the next paragraph very clearly insists that churches and religious organizations are essentially allowed to discriminate or choose who they will perform these ordinances for. So it says, consistent with First Amendment to the Constitution, nonprofit religious organizations, including churches, mosques, synagogues, temples, non-denominational ministries, interdenominational and ecumenical organizations, mission organizations, faith-based social agencies, religious educational institutions, nonprofit entities, whose principal purpose is the study, practice, or advancement of religion, and any employee, any full-time, part-time, whatever, of such an organization, and lay people and whatever, shall not be required to provide services, accommodations, advantages, facilities, goods, or privileges, anything, for the solemnization or celebration of a marriage. Any refusal under this subsection to provide such services, accommodations, advantages, facilities, goods, or privileges shall not create any civil claim or cause of action. And I think that's it. That's generally the whole law. And so clearly we're saying with this law that although all the government entities now recognize same-sex marriage as a legal marriage, the churches and any religious organization shall not ever be required, no cause of action can be taken against them if they decide not to perform a marriage, or to participate in performing a marriage, or celebrating that marriage. But then we have this a little bit of what's still gray area when it comes to individuals and non-religious organizations. Very little is said about them except that one sentence about their conscience. I want to go back to it. It seems like that's where this act is the least clear and the most gray, and where a lot of future litigation is going to surround, and a lot of future bills and things are going to focus on this. This act does not prohibit discrimination against homosexuals and same-sex marriages and whatever for individuals and other people who choose because of their own conscience, their own religious preferences,
right,
not
right.
to serve.
The thing is, I think it's a good medium in that, like, as far, let's take, for example, racism. Okay, so as far as, I know people argue against this and like the application of it might be uneven, but like as far as is legally possible, the government has, everywhere that they have jurisdiction, made it illegal to discriminate based on race whatsoever, like in a workplace, college or university, government itself, marriage or anything like that. And so they've anywhere that they have power, they've said it's illegal, like you can't do this. And also, like, if you commit like a hate crime or something and it's based on race, like that's also prosecutable, and it has a little higher consequences if it's like based on that kind of discrimination. So I think equally applied here in that like this is as far as the government should reach, because like
Well,
I
but
personally,
you
this
can't
is
you
my
can't
conservative
prohibit
side.
you can't not serve people based on their race. You know,
Well, that's
you could
where,
get
yeah.
sued.
I think this is only in relating to marriage specifically though, but I guess you could say, okay, for the cake baker guy, he now doesn't have to serve them and he doesn't have to worry about, at least according to this particular rule. The thing is, there's other laws out there that address, maybe I'm wrong, but like, I mean, if he like literally said like it's, you know, if he went to their house and like threw cake at a gay couple's house and like boo, you can't, like, you could still be prosecuted because of that, because that's like a hate crime, right? But just saying I refuse to do service for you because it's against my religion to celebrate a homosexual union as something good and grand. I don't know, that's where the debate continues of, is that where we want to be as a society? But I don't, you know, this is my personal opinion as a conservative. I like smaller government. And so saying, you know, the less the government has to say about my personal opinions, the better. However,
Yeah,
I
but we
would
want to protect these people
well,
from.
yeah,
Yeah,
race is a bad parallel there, because I would feel it should be legal for, yeah, a gay person to come like, hi, I'd like to come eat at your restaurant. Like, I refuse to serve you food because that supports your blackness or something. You know, it's not exactly one to one because, but still, it's close enough
yeah,
that that's hard.
it's it's definitely not a comfortable feeling to think about somebody walking into a local corner shop and to be denied service because we don't serve your kind here. You know, whether your kind is racial or whether it's based on sexual orientation or religion or whatever. If I'm walking into a shop and somebody looks at me and says, you're one of those Mormons, right? And I'm not going to serve you. You know, that's we want to. That doesn't feel right. Now, it seems a little different to have a church say, look, we're only performing ordinances for members of our church. We're only providing, you know, the Eucharist or as a sacrament or, you know, temple sealings for members of our own church who meet certain criteria. And we've defined it this way. And, you know, that doesn't seem as weird then to have somebody walking in and they're saying, you can't just get married in our temples. But, you know, if we're performing marriages for just about anyone in churches and you don't have to be a member of the church, this is where, you know, where, as I was talking with friends and others, you know, 10 years ago, this question of, if we're willing to perform a marriage in a church, a legal marriage for just about anyone, whether they're members of the church or not, then yeah, could the laws of the land decide that since gay marriage is legal, that all legal marriages, that anyone who performs a legal marriage must perform, you know, must be willing to perform a gay marriage. Anyway, that was the question that this seems to resolve, first of all. But what this doesn't seem to resolve is this idea of the individual. Now, the individual discrimination from a company or from an individual. But I want to point out that I did just notice something here. Yeah. And I should have noticed this before here, but it says that, again, this isn't saying, look, it's okay for you to discriminate if it's in accordance with your conscience or your religious liberty to discriminate. This says this does not diminish or abrogate a religious liberty or conscience protection otherwise available to an individual or an organization, meaning we're not creating a religious liberty or conscience protection that wasn't previously here, nor are we taking one away. And
that's what the opposite side or the conservatives have been arguing. Like, technically, like, this gains nothing because, you know, it's in the Constitution already that you can't discriminate based on religion. And so we didn't actually get any more rights here. It's just, like I said, enumerating it in this context. So
right. And if that First Amendment right, you know, the Congress shall make no law respecting establishment of religion or the free exercise thereof. If that right is, if the courts determine that right permits the cake bakers to hold their stance, then that right still exists after this law. But if the courts determine that the Constitution does not permit that right, then that right does not exist. So this law does not change
It
that.
it just
And
doesn't
so-
say either way. Yeah.
Yeah, all
Um,
right.
One other thing I wanted, and I think, at least as far as, okay, I have a couple of conspiracy theories. Let's put on my conspiracy theory hat about kind of what also the church is needing to do. And again, here's my, I'll give it my my positive spin, and then maybe, you know, a more negative possible spin of, in the positive way, I think the conversations the church has had and understood from its own members about LGBTQ people have changed their view a little bit, and instead of saying, like I was saying earlier, like instead of viewing homosexual stuff as like, you know, I'm sure they still think like homosexual sex itself is like, you know, a sin and all that. That's not going to change. But I think they've shifted their rhetoric, at least, of being accepting to people that are homosexual. Whereas, you know, there was an Oaks talk a couple years or a few years ago about him, like, you know, if you have your gay people and they come to your house, you can be like, okay, I guess you can sleep here, but we're not going to take you out to dinner or lunch, or I don't exactly remember what it said, but it was basically along the lines like, you know, we're not going to support you in any way whatsoever. We're not going to give you money. We're not going to give you a big wedding. You can go get married and do your thing, but, you know, LDS people shouldn't support this in any way. Where he's not necessarily coming out and saying, or this isn't saying we have to celebrate that, but I think it's whittling away all of the social part of that. Whereas, you know, and it harkens a little bit back to what I was saying with the race conversation last week, where I was talking about how polygamous sects, or at least some that they've interviewed, they still have the ban for the priesthood ban for people of any African blood in them whatsoever, whatever. And I was surprised to learn that, at least in their view, they don't do it because they think it's racist. They do it because of how it relates to the doctrine of the church, right? And how they view like how being worthy for the temple and stuff. And so I think this kind of puts the church in that position where it's like, you know, they're still going to discriminate in their own way, and they're probably not anytime soon, as you know, at least as long as these particular leaders are in charge and sans any revelation on it, they're not going to change the policy, like how, you know, a homosexual marriage wouldn't be performed in the church, let's say, and being like, yes, we want to do that in the temple and all that because that's just how we do it. But I think you're going to hear, hopefully, no more talks about not welcoming LGBTQ people. In fact, hopefully to the opposite, of saying, let's do everything, like let's look at our stake in it. Let's whittle away our societal prejudices and say what is actually important to the church. And I think hopefully this is where we're landing. And because they've, you know, the church in the last few years has, a lot of the millennials coming up and the next generation is a lot more progressive, especially socially. And there's been mass, you know, exodus from the church, or at least that's how it's been portrayed. I don't know if that's actually true according to the numbers, but, you know, conversions have seemed to slow down a little bit according to the numbers than they were in the past 20 years. And I think they really do fear that they're losing the next generation because of this issue specifically. Also, Oaks, you know, let's say what President Nelson right now, he's what, 96 or 7 or whatever. He ain't getting any younger, and Oaks is next in line to be prophet. And he's historically said a lot of stuff on this issue that would probably cause a lot more mass resignations once he becomes prophet, unless there's some sort of social rehabilitation or the church publicly changes their stance in a really big way. So I think, you know, that's my negative spin. Like some of it might be to help position them in the future to, you know, soften whatever possible blow that could cause once Oaks becomes the prophet. But hopefully
you
also
think that Oaks is preparing the world for when he becomes prophet?
Well, not him specifically, but the church itself is like, you know, what can we do to like make sure that, you know, this person that has been a very controversial on this subject in the past is now.
But who would be making that move? Who, you know, assuming this version of the conspiracy theory is true, who is the one that is softening, you know, the stance? Who's making that softening when Oaks is already number 2? I mean, how do you?
Well, hopefully, the positive side is Oaks himself and the church is making that move based on conversations, and he's a very legal person. And you know, I have also a legal person in my family that's very conservative, and they have shared some of the same concerns. But as things have played out, I think, like I said, some of those cultural biases against homosexual people have to be whittled away and like, okay, what's our actual stake in this? And I think Oakes, hopefully, and those that he influences and the lawyers of the church or whatever that are looking out for religious liberty are coming around to be like, okay, our stake is this type of law, and we can support that, because in the end of the day, like the polygamists are saying, like, we're not racist, right? We're not anti-homosexual people. They're God's children. They should be loved. Like, we're not actually homophobes or bigots, right? Okay, so if we're not, then we need to make, like, that's kind of been portrayed. So we need to make a lot of olive branches and make room, as much room as we possibly can, given our current state of revelation, for homosexual people to be included in this church. Otherwise, it's a big issue. And I argued a long time ago when we did this too. Like, I see that point of view. Like, there's not a lot of, it'd be really hard to see your place in this religion if you were a homosexual person and you viewed that as like an eternal trait of yourself. But
So
yeah.
two final things that I'd like to point out before we wrap up here. But one is I did skip this paragraph here in the bill that we should comment on. No federal recognition of polygamous marriages. Nothing in this act or any amendment made by this act shall be construed to require or authorize federal recognition of marriages between more than two individuals. And so there's this, we've heard that everything above, it mentioned two individuals twice. Now it mentions it for the third time. And this paragraph seems to be saying, look, we are not recognizing a polygamous marriage as a legal marriage. However, I want to point out that nothing shall be construed to require or authorize federal recognition. Of marriages between more than two individuals. So this act could be construed to require or authorize state recognition. Is that possible here?
Well, I feel like if you use the logic of the Supreme Court ruling and you apply it to plural marriage, I think you'd have to accept plural marriage as one of the valid ways that people could express their love, or however they worded it. So
if a state decides to legalize a plural marriage, then essentially is full faith and credit extended to that marriage in the other states. It appears not federally, but statewise. What do you here? Let's take a quick look back here at where they've mentioned the two individuals in earlier points of this. And where are they? Let's see. Here we are. For the purpose of any federal law, of any, again, federal law, rule, or regulation in which marital status is a factor, because this is all federal. So two individuals. So yeah, this paragraph was about how the federal government is going to recognize marriages, and it talked about two individuals. Moving back up here, full faith and credit. No person acting under the color of a state law may deny full faith and credit to any public act or judicial proceeding of any other state pertaining to a marriage between two individuals on the basis of sex, race, ethnicity, or national origin. So what if if I have entered into a legal polygamous marriage in some state where it's legal, and then I and my wives move to another state where it's illegal, each marriage is between me and that other individual, right? That other wife. It's still between two individuals. So it does seem that those who are sounding, quote unquote, the alarm, saying, hey, this could authorize or legitimize or legalize polygamy. And that's why that paragraph was added, was because there is a conservative, contingent, a religious group that's saying one of the fears we have about this Respect for Marriage Act is that it will legalize polygamy. And it does seem that this bill will still in fact extend full faith and credit to a polygamous marriage throughout the states if it becomes legal in any state, just not federally. What do you think?
Well, I think most of the, maybe, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think most of the legal benefits of marriage are on the federal level. Maybe there are some tax credits, and I think some child tax credits you could get or something like that. But other than that, I think most of them are federal. And so the thing it's not necessarily illegal now to at least federally, to do that. So if it was, let's say Utah decided they were going to legalize that now, or in Mexico, you could go and get, that's has to be in the states though. I think that would apply to, but
But
let's
I
say one
mean,
state did
yeah,
legalize
you got to
it.
have at least one state. You got to have at least one state that legalizes polygamy for this to for you to move into the country from some Middle Eastern or other country where polygamy is legal, and then you move into a state. If you were married, as I understand the law, if you were married, if you actually engaged or entered into that polygamous marriage in that foreign country at a time when the polygamous marriage was legal in a state, then it appears to be that your marriage would be recognized under state law. Which no, I think there are
At least one of
definitely
them would.
Well, yeah, I mean, but if you said, but I'm also married to this one other person, and
Well,
it's just between me and her.
Well, I think they'd have to say, like, you can't be married to more than one person. One of those marriages is illegal. The rest of them are invalid. You could pick one, but they can't all
No,
be legal at
because
the same time.
no, because in the state of Colorado, Utah, wherever, it is legal. And so therefore, yes, both marriages are legal because in this state, they're both legal. And if they're both legal in this state, then they must have full faith and credit in all the states.
Maybe.
And there are absolutely marriage protections under state law in other than just the federal tax protection. I mean, no, there's state taxes, but also that's where we get into insurance and the rights to visit people in the hospital, and all those are all state law,
That's
things.
true.
So, all right, the last thing that I want to point out is to circle back around to where we started originally, with the idea that of why the church even cares so much, and why the church has a different position than, say, other churches, Christian churches. And the funny thing is that I wish we had Joey on here to comment a little bit more about how he sees this in particular, and what he knows about what other Christian churches, how they see this. But my understanding is, of course, there are some Christian churches that are fully in favor of same-sex marriages, and they'll perform same-sex marriages within their congregations, and absolutely they think that it has that discriminating against homosexual marriages or homosexuals in any way has nothing to do with the gospel of love from Jesus Christ. And then there are other Christian churches who think that this is absolutely wrong, and that that marriage is between one man and one woman, and it's meant to be symbolic of the marriage of Christ and the church. And I guess the church is the bride in this case, and Christ is the groom. And so there cannot be anything other than a bride and a groom. And anyway, that's my understanding. But our church comes from a different perspective, as you pointed out at the beginning. And so just to end with that, we have D&C section 131, where we have, in the celestial glory, there are 3 heavens or degrees. And the celestial glory is the highest kingdom of heaven, right? And in order to obtain the highest degree within that celestial kingdom, so to go to the very best place in heaven, a man must enter into this order of the priesthood, meaning the new and everlasting covenant of marriage. And if he does not, he cannot obtain it. He may enter into the other degrees or kingdoms, but that is the end of his kingdom. He cannot have an increase. And then D&C 132 is much about this idea of celestial marriage. It does get into plural marriage or polygamy in here, but the new and everlasting, as pertaining to the new and everlasting covenant, it was instituted for the fullness of my glory, and he that receiveth the fullness thereof must and shall abide the law, or he shall be damned, saith the Lord God. And verily, the conditions of this law are these: all covenants, contracts, bonds, obligations, oaths, vows, performances, connections, associations, or expectations that are not made and entered into and sealed by the Holy Spirit of promise. So here we have this idea that they have that all covenants, all marriages, all oaths, all contracts that are not sealed by the Holy Spirit of promise have an end when men are dead. But then down here we have where am I? Remind me what verse I'm looking for here real quick. Here we are. But if a man marry a wife and make a covenant with her for time and for all eternity, by the new and everlasting covenant, and it is sealed upon them by the Holy Spirit of promise, by him who is anointed, then, and it shall be said unto them, ye shall come forth in the first resurrection. I should have highlighted this in advance because I didn't want to read the whole thing, but it says here, Then it shall be done unto them on all things whatsoever my servant has put upon them in time and through all eternity, and shall be of full force when they are out of this world. And they shall pass by the angels and the gods which are set there to their exaltation and glory in all things, as hath been sealed upon their heads, which glory shall be a fullness and continuation of the seeds forever and ever. And so essentially, this is the key and the core doctrine in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints for entering the highest degree of the celestial kingdom of God and becoming like our Father and Mother in heaven, is this celestial marriage for time and all eternity. And so the question is whether that kind of a marriage can be between two people of the same gender. And as of right now, the church says, no, the doctrine is no, this is a man and a woman, and they don't want in the church to be forced to perform these ordinances for other than one man and one woman. Corey, go ahead. You
So,
want to?
yeah, the last thing from it's like, you know, this doesn't solve any of the tensions necessarily within the church on this doctrine, but I think as far as the church versus the rest of the world on this doctrine goes, I think this is pretty much this is as good as it can possibly get. You get your marriages, you get all that. Our religious freedoms are protected. So, you know, if we want to in the future, we can get it, you know, or if God wants to, he can give the prophets of Revelation to change that. But as of right now, this is our doctrine. And so we want to be able to freely, you know, express the religion and have this doctrine be, you know, what it is to us. One of the if not the most important, you know, besides like, you know, being able to be forgiven by Jesus Christ and the atonement, this is probably the next one that's the clincher for most people that join our church of eternal families.
And
Yeah.
so I guess I mean, I want to wrap this up, but a question popped into my head is whether or not the look at that. I didn't even realize I have, you know, this great shadow on the screen behind me like that. Anyways, but whether the marriage, the rights of the churches and the ability of individuals to practice and worship according to their own conscience would have been still protected without the Senate amendments if we had just left it with the House version that simply said full faith and credit extended to all the states. All states must recognize a marriage that is valid in any state, and the federal government must recognize a marriage that's valid in any state. That just says states and the government. And so it doesn't seem to need the amendment, except that the amendment comes right out and says, look, churches who are receiving tax exempt status and who are receiving, you know, any other assistance. I suppose we talk about, you know, BYU getting assistance in the form of Pell Grants from the government, that none of that shall be removed from religious organizations. I suppose there's that's where the fear of the church is, saying, look, we will not, we as soon as this
BYU
amendment,
too, yeah.
yeah, as soon as this amendment was added, the church came out in full support and said, okay, it looks like nothing can be taken from us because of our doctrines.
And that's
all right,
something
well,
we can support.
well, thanks for joining me, Corey. We didn't see Marty here or any of our others, but it was, what was that?
So they can chime in on YouTube comments or in our back channel. You know.
Yeah.
Please do.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And we'll